Hey guys, welcome to a special edition of the Vinyl Rundown. Today we're talking about and remembering Hal Blaine, perhaps the greatest and most influential drummer of the vinyl and rock record era. Died this week at the age of 90. I'm going to tell you a little bit about him, why he's important, and tell you the story about when I met him in the early 80s. Headline: they don't even mention his name. Some drummer who is old. He played with Sinatra and Elvis, and he died. Okay, Hal Blaine lived to be 90, and he recorded on more records than anybody in history in terms of drumming. He was the top session drummer in Hollywood from, I don't know the years, late 50s, all through the 60s, into the 70s. He was a session drummer, and he coined the phrase wrecking crew. You may have heard about the Wrecking Crew, which was a group of the top studio musicians. These were the top session guys that Hollywood producers knew that they could call on anytime they needed top-notch guys to come in and do a session. So Hal Blaine supposedly played on like 6,000 singles and maybe 20 or 30,000 recordings overall. That includes things like movies and TV commercials and what else? What else could you record? Anything you'd hire a drummer to play on. The Wrecking Crew and or Hal Blaine was probably there. So when I make a claim like he is the greatest drummer of that era, most influential, well, he played on so many thousands of records. He played on records that are in your collection that you don't know he played on because they were uncredited. The whole thing with the musicians of that era, or the studio musicians, was the record industry was a profit-making, we got to sell a lot of records. We got to have a hit. And studio time was expensive. They hired the top guys who could come in, read the chart, knock it out of the park, get it done, and move on to the next session. So he might be recording with the Beach Boys in the morning and might be doing a toothpaste commercial in the afternoon. And some of these guys would do 4, 5, 6, 7 sessions a day, and they made approximately $25 per session. So even though the Beach Boys or whoever went on to sell millions and millions of copies of the record, the studio musicians only got paid $25, but they cranked through so many of these, they actually ended up making pretty good money. Hal Blaine went through 2 really rough divorces, and he was basically financially ruined by the 80s, and he took odd jobs like security guard. But in the early 80s, people that I played music with kind of knew him, and so my drummer that I used to play with in high school actually took lessons with Hal. So that's why I got to go over to Hal's house and meet him. And I really didn't know who he was back then. Everybody was saying, oh, Hal Blaine, he's the greatest. Oh man, he's giving lessons? It was like hard to believe that he was giving lessons, but he was financially down on his luck. Anyway, I'm going to give you a kind of a listing of some of the records he's played on. So let me go into my mental... Okay, the list of tunes that Hal Blaine played on is a massive list. I'm only going to give you the top dozen or so. The Ronettes, Be My Baby. So Hal was very instrumental in helping Phil Spector put together the Wall of Sound. Played the drums. A lot of Beach Boys stuff, including Good Vibrations, Sonny and Cher, Got You Babe. Simon and Garfunkel did a lot of stuff with them. Mrs. Robinson and Bridge Over Troubled Waters and The Boxer. A lot of stuff with Frank and Nancy Sinatra. These Boots Are Made for Walking. The Byrds, Tambourine Man, Elvis Presley, Return to Sender, the Batman theme song, Fifth Dimension, Aquarius, Neil Diamond, Cracklin' Rose. Did a lot of stuff, probably most of the stuff with the Mamas and the Papas, Captain and Tennille. The list goes on and on and on. There's a huge Wikipedia page of tunes that he played on, like hit songs. Doesn't even include commercials and TV shows and movies. So, backing up a little bit to this concept of the Wrecking Crew, which I was talking about as the top list of studio musicians in LA. There's a movie that came out that you must see called The Wrecking Crew. And this is a documentary 4 or 5 years ago made by the son of Tommy Tedesco. Tommy Tedesco, guitar player, kind of the ringleader of the Wrecking Crew in some respects. One of the top studio musicians of all time. His son Denny Tedesco put together this documentary, interviewed as many of the players that they could find, including Hal Blaine, lots of other people. You must see this movie. It's not optional. If you're on the VC, if you're a record collector, you must see it. I think it's available on Netflix. The Tedesco family, music tradition lives on. One of Tommy's nephews is kind of a friend of ours, not too far from here, one of the top studio horn players in LA. A couple little cute anecdotes about Hal Blaine. He marked his territory like men and wild animals do. He had this rubber stamp. It said like Hal Blaine struck here, and he put that all over the place. Like every score of music, he would stamp right on the music. And the drummer, what do they call the little box that the drummer plays in, the little drum room? Inside the studio, right on the wall. So psychologically, he's like telling everybody else in town, hey, Hal Blaine was here before you. Hal Blaine is everywhere. I thought it was kind of funny that he did that. So his funeral was, a couple days ago, and his family released a statement saying that, Hal Blaine, may he forever rest on 2 and 4. That's a bad drummer joke. Sheet music, the beat, 2 and 4, blah, blah. I thought it was funny. This record, found for at a thrift store for $1. Hal Blaine is not known as a recording artist, so this is kind of a sampling of tunes that he's played on, but I think they're actually all re-recorded for this record. Drums A Go-Go with Hal Blaine, Wooly Bully, Whiskey A Go-Go, Rumble, La Bamba, all kinds of early rock tunes, like when rock and roll was still in its formative years. So when I say Hal Blaine was the most influential, maybe the greatest drummer of his era, the way he defined great musician was different than maybe the way some of you vinyl collectors define great musicians. So I'll let his definition sort of lead where I'm going with this. Because some of you are saying, oh no, it was definitely John Bonham or whatever. Well, Hal Blaine really brought a professionalism to music that was lacking. And that's one reason why they wouldn't even let people like the Beach Boys play on their own records. Okay, the Beach Boys, they might have been good musicians, but not necessarily good enough to get it done on the first take and get it done in tempo and in tune and on time. So Hal Blaine's whole thing is, if you want to call yourself a great musician, you got to be responsible. You got to show up to the gig on time, sober. He never did drugs. He rarely drank. And he was a professional throughout his whole life. Well, when he was recording, into his 80s. So by Hal Blaine's definition, he played on more hit records than any other drummer in history. So anyway, guys, my camera is running out of juice. I am going, so that's the Hal Blaine story in a nutshell. He's not credited on many of the records that he played on, so you got to look at Wikipedia to figure out what he played on. Check out that Wrecking Crew documentary, and thank you for watching. We'll check you soon.